Well, thank you ever so much for having me along here, and it's a pleasure to be at another Football and More event. Really what I'm going to do today is just give you a quick overview as to a series that I've been working on over the last 2 years or so, depicting various stories about football and the Great War. I would say it's an awful lot easier to be in Exeter, because I actually only live in Arlington, up in North Devon, so it's in an hour or so for me, as opposed to Dulwich, which was about a 10-hour round trip to get there for the day. So to give you a little introduction about me, my illustration background really comes from a very young age. I was interested in drawing, and ended up going off to art school, finding my way into graphic design, and then about 6 years ago I was offered funding to do a PhD in architecture, looking at the war memorials and war cemeteries out in France and Belgium. And when I got that opportunity, I realised that I could also create space to do what I really wanted to do when I was younger, and that was to become an illustrator. And so I used the illustration as a way to decompress from the research throughout the day. I didn't want to completely disconnect from that research, so that I was still up to speed when I started the next day. So I began illustrating elements related to stories I'd been reading about throughout my research day. In the evening I would sit down and start drawing them. And a friend of mine said to me one day, "These are actually quite good, you should probably share these with people." So I set up a little blog at first, just sharing them, and slowly but surely people got in touch to say how much they liked them, and could I do this and could I do that, and etc. And so it grew and grew to the point that once my funding stopped for my PhD, I still hadn't finished my PhD, and I now had a full-time illustration business that was doing very well, and so I continued doing both of them. And my principal focus was the First World War, and I started a website called Illustrating the Great War. Don't look for it; it's not there anymore. But it's really the start of things. These four illustrations are all from this year. There's obviously been many and various other ones, but they give you a kind of a feel of the bread and butter of my First World War illustrations. Now, whilst I am interested in the First World War, is obviously a whole range of elements. You'll notice from the first ones, I try not to deal with death. Everyone knows that a lot of people died, but there were also a lot of people that didn't die, and there's a whole lot of stories around that as well. One of those stories of the unfortunate soldiers that did die was this Percy, and this was one of the few examples you'll find in my work of wounding, injury, and all the bad stuff. But this was a book that I illustrated, which actually I discovered last week or the week before has just been put up for a book prize. So fingers crossed, we'll find out at the end of October if we won that. But beyond the First World War, as with lots of young boys, I've always had a fascination with football, mainly playing it when I was a kid, and then as I got older and realised I wasn't going to be a professional footballer, I began doing what I do with every other aspect of my life, started looking at the history of a given subject, and that's taken me down many routes with the illustration, and these are just a selection of some of the things that I've ended up doing. So book covers, programme covers, limited edition prints with other design houses, many and various different things. But really it started to, again, it was the love of drawing and drawing things I love. And so the First World War and football were kind of obvious outlets. And then I guess it would have been 2 years ago exactly, almost to the day, there is a social media drive in October which is called Inktober, and the idea is that you draw something every day using ink, and you share it, and you share it on the hashtag Inktober. And the idea came to me that that is a lot of work, but maybe if I created a template, then I could create something. And so the first thing that I thought was, why don't I bring the two things I love together, the football and the First World War, and illustrate some of the stories of the First World War and football. And so I decided to create this series called Footballers of the Great War. Now, I'm not going to apologise in the slightest for the fact that this is Plymouth Argyle, because number one, Billy Baker, I chose Billy Baker because 2 years ago I just met a lovely young lady, and her father had played for Plymouth Argyle, and I thought, I'll see if I can get in his good books. So the first player I did was Billy Baker. I'm not a Devon man originally. I've only been here a couple of years, but I do go down and watch Argyle relatively frequently. I'm going quite a lot greyer over the last year or so. But Billy Baker was really quite an impressive character. I don't know how many of you know of Billy Baker. He was one of the members of the Footballers Battalion, which we'll go into later on, and he was the star of Plymouth Argyle at the time. He really was their principal player, and he goes off to war and is killed, and it seemed such a kind of a marker for me that, I mean, as Martin was saying, you see modern players now. Can you imagine the current star going off and not just fighting, dying, not coming back? That's the end of it. And there seemed so much pathos in that story that I wanted to illustrate it. That said, I was also very conscious that quite a few footballers came back as well, so I didn't want the series to become a memorial series where it was just dead soldiers. Now, as I'm sure all of those that research players will find out and have found out, the problem with this kind of series is that the players that get researched are the ones that died. So you can often very quickly find out information about that player. As soon as you know that player died, you can build quite a biography pretty quickly. It's the players that kind of disappear off into obscurity that are quite often harder to track down and find out the details. So it's been a constant kind of a constant battle to not completely fill this with soldiers that died, but try and get some of the other stories in there. Now, the Billy Baker connection doesn't end there, because having produced Billy Baker and latterly the Jimmy McCormick, who was another Footballers Battalion member of Argyle, having done both of these illustrations, the design company that organised all the programmes for Argyle got in touch with me and said, look, it depends how the FA Cup draw falls, but it looks like we're going to have we could end up with a home tie on the 10th of November, that's Saturday the 10th of November. We'd like to do, if that happens, we'd like to do a special programme cover. Would you be interested? I thought, that sounds like a good idea. And it did, and they ended up drawing Stevenage. And so Billy Baker, again, featured on the right-hand side of the programme. So that was a wraparound cover with the spine going through the middle of the football there. And it was a deliberate piece of design work as well, in the respect that if you took that down the centre, Billy Baker was killed. His two brothers, who are represented as the sailor and the soldier in the background, were both killed, and that's their father there. On the left-hand side, the chap, I forget the player's name, who's at the in the foreground here. He survived, had been in the Royal Navy as well, and then the two soldiers in the crowd, one had gone on to win the VC and survived the war. and one had survived the war and had gone on to become the chairman of the London branch of the Plymouth Argyle Supporters Club for quite a number of years after the war. So it was a kind of intended to capture the two sides of it, that yes, we should remember all those that died, but also there's a massive legacy of the war on those that come back and have to deal with it. And so that directly came from the start of that Football and the Great War series. So you'll be pleased to know I'm now moving on from Plymouth, and you can all listen again. So the rest of the series, as I said, it was really about capturing the whole kind of gamut of, or as much as I can, those football stories related to the First World War. There's very obvious ones. I'm sure many of you will have heard of or come across something to do with the story of Walter Tull. So it would be inconceivable not to include him, which I duly did. Willie Angus, another one, who was a Celtic reserve player. As it seems, you'll see as we go through this, it seems that every Scottish footballer that went off to the First World War at some point had trials with Celtic. Whether it's a kind of an urban legend or whether it's actually true, but they do. Celtic seem to have been very good at identifying footballers and giving them a go in the reserves. Willie Angus was a territorial soldier, and at the outbreak of war, a company of his unit, the 8th Highland Light Infantry, were transferred into the 8th Royal Scots, including his platoon commander. He is over with the 8th Royal Scots, and his platoon commander gets wounded in no man's land. He goes out into no man's land, brings his platoon commander back, and is subsequently awarded the Victoria Cross. It goes a bit further in that his platoon commander was also from the same village, Carluke, and they both survived, and so there's a whole number of photographs of them after the event in Carluke, and Willie Angus has a street named after him in Carluke. Carluke is a tiny place. My grandmother was actually born in Carluke, and Carluke had another VC winner, so there's 2 streets in Carluke named after these particular individuals. So these are 2 of the kind of more, if well known is the right phrase, but amongst the fraternity of football historians and First World War historians, these are 2 of the more well-known examples of where football and the First World War collide. Another one is the Footballers Battalion, the 17th Middlesex. Again, I really was very keen to include these. There's a range of different footballers in there. James Williams, or James McWilliam, depending on which source you look at, was particularly of interest to me. He played for Crystal Palace until the 1914-15 season, when he'd been transferred to Millwall, and he's a very early service number within the battalion. My great uncle, Percival Furlong, was a Millwall fan who signed up in the Footballers Battalion, and there was no other Millwall player other than James Williams with an earlier service number than my great uncle. Now I know from the enlistment that he was at the meeting that James Williams was at when he signed up. I have no reason I can't absolutely say this to the case, but I suspect that seeing James Williams sign up was one of the reasons that my own relative signed up and was unfortunately killed with the battalion, and is remembered at Tiep Val. There's a whole range of other stories in there as well. Port Vale are one of the few teams that feature twice in the series so far, and the reason it's twofold. The reason they feature twice. One is I've got a very good friend who's a Port Vale fan. The other is it's just a really nice kit. It's got one of those big sweeping V's, and I thought, God, and gold and black. I thought, yeah, that's a nice kit. So there's another one. He's on here, Jack Shelton, So there are a few that feature twice, but most of them, there's only one representative at the moment. But the Footballers' Battalion is obviously one that is a key footballing story within the war, and that's one of obviously the official stories. At the moment, I don't have any of the 3 Leyton Orient players that were killed, or Clapton Orient as they were at the time, that were killed in the war. But this is another piece that I've worked on aside from the series, which shows McFadden and Jonas, the kind of the real stars of that Clapton Orient side, who also were both killed serving with the Footballers' Battalion. The series itself has kind of snowballed in something that I kind of started with the intention of kind of, this will make my life a bit easier to get as an illustrator, to get my profile a bit higher throughout this Inktober project, which I hasten to add, I never got the whole Inktober project finished. It kind of things get out of hand, but slowly but surely it started getting quite a bit of coverage, and I think partly because the stories that I was covering and still cover with it aren't the bog standard stories. There's a lot of humanity involved in them, and there's also the connections with the smaller clubs, the smaller stories, and I think a lot of people found that of great interest. Again, around the Remembrance Day / FA Cup weekend last season, Match of the Day and Football Focus got in touch with me and asked if they could commission a piece to go into the series, and they were doing a special feature which some of you may have watched, that was shown on Football Focus, and then the half time of I think it was MK Dons game. Did MK Dons play Met Police or someone like that in the 3rd round? It was something like that, and they showed it at half time in that as well. And the player they chose was Sandy Turnbull, who had a very mixed life. He was a very, very, very well-known footballer. He'd been Manchester City, and then when Manchester City, shockingly, had some financial irregularities.
Can't believe that.
No, I know, it doesn't ring true, does it? They'd had some financial irregularities, and they'd had to have a fire sale of a whole load of their top players, and Sandy Turnbull was one of them. Manchester United went in, cleaned out a few of them, and Sandy Turnbull joined United. He was one of the founding members and one of the key spokesmen of the Players' Union, so he was very important from that aspect of things. He is then ejected from the game in 1914 for a betting scandal between a Manchester United and Liverpool game. There were, I think, 3, possibly 4 players that were given lifelong bans from any form of football at all for their involvement in this scandal. The war then comes along shortly afterwards, and the ban still holds true, to the point that he joins the 2nd Battalion of the Footballers' Battalion initially, and he wants to play for the Battalion Football Club, and they write to the FA, who say no, he's been banned from playing football, so he doesn't turn out for the Battalion football team. He's only trained with that battalion. He then transfers to the 8th or 9th East Surreys, and that's out in France. At which point he decides, what are they going to do? What are they going to send me to war? What can they do realistically if I play football? So he does turn out for the battalion football team over there, and he's also, as you'd expect with a lot of footballers, they naturally become very good soldiers because they're used to the team ethos. They're used to that kind of support work, and most of them, particularly the Sandy Turnbull type characters, aren't afraid to direct when it comes down to it, and they're very key things on a battlefield as well. So Sandy Turnbull is a very, very well considered soldier as well. Again, Sandy's story ends in being killed on the battlefield, and that was part of the reason they were telling the story on Match of the Day. But it kind of highlights the real depth of stories behind each of these illustrations, which for me are kind of a start point, and I like to consider them as a start point. People look at them and go, who on earth is this person? And maybe even look to find what the story is. The English Footballers Battalion obviously had absorbed quite a number of the professional footballers who went off to serve. In Scotland, there wasn't a formal footballers battalion, but what there was the 16th Battalion Royal Scots, who were the 2nd City of Edinburgh Battalion, otherwise known as Macrae's Own. The colonel in command was George Macrae, a local politician and very well-known member of society, formed this battalion, and he managed to get the Heart of Midlothian side to sign up en masse. So the majority of the first team of Heart of Midlothian, who weren't already connected with a territorial unit, signed up to the 16th Royal Scots. Now, you just can't stress this one enough. Heart of Midlothian at the time, the 1914-15 Hearts team is probably the greatest Hearts team they've ever had. Before the training regime kicks in, they are walking away with the league title. They are leagues ahead of Celtic. And then the training regime of being an infantry battalion kicks in, and the results start to drop off. Now, there's a great deal of animosity at the time because Celtic have not signed up any of their players. You've had your Willie Angus, who was a reserve, and he's gone off with the Territorials, but there are none of the first team of Celtic sign up to go and serve overseas. So they've got a full squad not doing military service, and they are catching up. And it eventually comes down, maybe even, I can't remember if it's the last game or the penultimate game of the season, Celtic win the league. And Hearts, with all their players suffering from all the fatigue of military training, the greatest side don't win the league, and it's still a bone of contention with Hearts fans now. That was their great side, and because they answered at the time what was considered a higher calling, they didn't get the rewards for it. So the 16th Royal Scots are that Hearts. Are who that Hearts team joined, and Harry Watty was one of the real stars of that side. But the 16th Royal Scots also took in a number of other sides. You had Wraith Rovers, Hibernian, Falkirk, and a whole range of other lower league sides as well from that area are all represented within the battalion. So that's the kind of the Scottish equivalent. But I didn't just want to make it about professional footballers as well. Football, as we all know in this room, is a lot deeper than just those that get paid to go and play it. There's fans, there's so many tiers of amateur and non-league and all sorts of football. And those stories were just as important to me. Bertie Powell on the left played for Heybridge Swifts they are now, Heybridge Football Club at the time, which is near Malden in Essex. I think he's the chairman of the supporters club at Heybridge. Got in touch and said, look, we've got this guy. He was the club secretary. He played. He was a real central figure to the way this club ran, and he was killed. And it took the club about 10 years to get over it because of how central he was in the running of the club. And he'd been a West Ham fan and had joined the West Ham Battalion, the location rather than the football club battalion, and again had been unfortunately killed. And they asked if they could have this as if he could go into the series, and I said, yeah, of course. And that particular image is now used as on their club's official history, they use the Bertie Powell image because of how central he was as a character to the story of the club. And again, the other thing is with the smaller teams, they don't get the newspaper. If they get newspaper coverage, it's words, it's not photographs. You don't have a huge photographic archive of these players. So images like this suddenly become a touchstone for the lost names. Reginald Salisbury is even more obscure, if that's possible. Reginald Salisbury was an old boy of my school, and I discovered that he played for, when he went up to Cambridge, he played for the college side. Never got above that, never found any connection with him with any other football side at all, other than my school side and his college side. And I thought, realistically, if I don't draw him and draw attention to him, there's probably not many other people in the world that will. He was one of the he's one of the really niche footballers in this series. Interestingly enough, he was at college at Cambridge with another player who appears later on, and I'll explain some of the crossovers, but it caused me a little bit of confusion, which I'll explain at the next his colleague. One of the interesting quirks that came out of the series was how many just all-round good athletes there were at that time. You've got these. You frequently got players who represented their local football side. They turned out for the county cricket side, and they dabbled in a bit of rugby, and maybe did a bit of boxing on the side as well. You know, there was these guys that just seemed to do all sorts. But one of the things that particularly came out was cricketers. There was a number of very well-known cricketers. I mean, Patsy Hendren went on to captain the MCC touring side, but had turned out for Brentford a number of times pre-war. Albert Iremonger came from a family of cricketers. His brother, he had a brother that played for Nottingham Forest as well, and his other brother also captained the MCC touring side. Last year, I had an exhibition of the series up to that point at the Forest ground, but prior to that at Trent Bridge. And when I wandered into the long room where the exhibition was being held, I found his brother's cricket bat hanging from the ceiling. So I was able to position his illustration below his brother's cricket bat in the long room, which was rather nice. Harold Back turned out for Warwickshire as well. He featured in the West Brom programme a couple of years ago when they did a little feature on my artwork. Now, one of the stories that frequently gets overlooked, or has previously been overlooked, but I thought I had an opportunity to kind of bring a little bit nearer to the forefront of the story, was the game that continued going on back in Britain once professional football has ceased, and the men are going off overseas. The football back at home is limited to regimental games, etc., etc. One of the things that begins to fill the void is the women's game, and I'm sure many of you will be aware of that. So I was very keen to tell some of those stories. Now, what started out as I should tell some of those stories actually became very difficult very quickly. Again, if I thought researching non-league football sides and the players that turned out for them was difficult, finding out, you see plenty of team photographs of women's football sides from munitions factories, etc., etc. Trying to find the names of them, even in the match reports, there are lots of match reports, there's never a name mentioned. What they tend to mention in the match reports is what they were wearing, not necessarily the quality of football, nothing like that. It's the kind of the circus element to it is what comes up, rather than any real incisive football analysis. So what that left me with was the conundrum of how to put these people in. Well, I'd made it about personalities and the stories around these individuals, and then I couldn't name the individuals. So I decided the only way I could do this was to pick players from the team photographs and still make them portraits, but they're just unknown portraits, unfortunately. Alice Kell was one of the few that I've been able to identify. I've not been able to has been identified for me to be able to use, because she played for a very, very famous side, and there was a number of them that were named for the Dick Kerr ladies from Preston. But for all the others, it's been a case of, well, if anyone out there can find them for me, I'm happy to draw them. And I've worked with a number of academics and interested people to try and find other named female footballers, and not just named and photographs, so a portrait can be made, and they just don't seem to be out there. So if you do come across anything, please do send it my way, because I'd love to include them. But it's a story that's really important to be told, because it does keep the game ticking over. As we know, there's a whole kind of legacy to what happens to women's football after the First World War, and to some extent it's only really in the last few years that has started, the damage of that legacy has started to be undone. So it's really important that they are included in this series. There's obviously non-combatants as well. Steve Bloomer, his name is still sung as a song by Derby County fans. There's a statue outside their stadium. He was technically not a footballer when the war broke out. He was a footballer up to the season before, and then he goes over to Germany to become a coach, and then war is declared, and he's put in an internment camp for the entire duration of the war. So he was a non-combatant footballer. Tommy Brittleton, this story does surprise me a little bit, given that he's a professional footballer. He was declared medically unfit to be a soldier, and he goes and works in a munitions factory. So I don't know what the reasoning was behind his illness, or why he couldn't join the war, but whatever it was, it didn't stop him being a footballer prior to the war. He is the only person in the series with the ball in his hands throwing the ball in, and that is because Tommy Brittleton invented the long throw. And it was actually his great grandnephew got in touch with me and asked me to include him in the series. It's not a story that I was familiar with, but because, and he was very concerned. It was quite touching. He was very concerned that he hadn't been a soldier. And I said, well, he's still, being a soldier isn't everything, and there's many and various ways that you live through a war, and it doesn't really matter what you do. You still have to deal with it, don't you? Whatever path you take, you still have to deal with it. And Tommy was no different. So there he is, about to do his long throw. Obviously, the majority of them are British in the series. There's one German in the series at the moment. There's a couple more. There's a Belgian and a couple of French players as well. And thinking about it, I think somebody got in touch about a Portuguese player as well. But Adolf Jäger has got a very close connection with Dulwich Hamlet, as have Altona 93. So he was asked to be included within the series by Dulwich Hamlet fans. But he is at the moment the only non-British player in the series. Now, just to kind of wind this down, I'll pop in a couple of other stories that kind of feature in subsets and within the set itself. Now, obviously, the Christmas Truce is possibly the most well-known, most argued about footballing incident of the Great War, and this set is based on the only corroborated story of, and I use the term football loosely, of a football match being played where a few guys from the 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Battalion Norfolks and the 6th Cheshire Territorial Unit had a kickabout with a small black rubber ball. So that's what this represents, is that particular incident. Other military figures that feature are Alan Lynch, who was a battalion level footballer. This was a really really fortunate piece. Again, if you're dealing with professional sides, even non-league sides, it's quite easy to find out what the kit was. When you get to battalion level football, the chances of there being a team photograph are slim to none, and the chances of knowing what the colours are, even if there is a battalion photograph or company photograph, are slim to none. A chap from Glasgow got in touch with me and said, "Oh, would you add Alan Lynch into it?" I said, "Yeah, I'd be happy to." You know, who did he play for? Well, and as you'd expect, he had trials for Celtic. I said, "Yes, that's a given." He said, "But he also played for his battalion, the 11th Scottish Rifles." I said, "Oh, right. What did their kit look like?" He said, "Well, fortunately enough, they kept one of the kits in the museum, so we've got one." And he sent me photographs of the original 11th Scottish Rifles kit, and that's what it looked like. But the regimental colours with a white star on the chest, and they had. Somebody had the foresight, presumably for illustrators in the future, that's the only thing I can imagine it for, somebody had the foresight to make a note of what the short colour was and what the socks were as well. So it was possible to kind of recreate that kit. One of the other famous footballing stories, which some of you will have come across, the 1st of July, Billy Neville, 8th East Surreys, which incidentally was the unit that Sandy Turnbull then joined later on. So one of the most famous footballing stories of the war ends up with one of the most famous footballers of the war serving in them. Billy Neville decides that to try and get his company's thoughts away from the fact they are about to run into machine guns, is that they'll have footballs that they'll kick, and the act of having something else to focus their attention on will reduce some of the fear of what is about to happen. To some extent it works. The 18th Division that he's in initially capture all their objectives, but because of the divisions either side aren't so fortunate, eventually they have to retract. But again, these are quite well documented. There's purportedly at least one of these balls still in existence. One of them was unfortunately lost a few years ago in the fire. The East Surrey's Museum was in a National Trust house, the name of which escapes me, but the house caught fire, and one of the original Somme footballs was in there. There is apparently another one, but personally speaking, I'm a little dubious as to whether it's actually one of the original Somme balls or whether it's a collector playing a bit fast and loose with authenticity. Another footballing story is the London Irish Rifles. Again, the footballer of Lewes. We were very fortunate at Dulwich. The London Irish Rifles, who are still in existence, brought along the actual football. So I was very fortunate to be able to hold the football that I just illustrated, and they have a copy of this in their regimental museum now. But again, just these little stories that are that bringing together of the First World War and football. And of course, I couldn't come all the way to Exeter and not have an Exeter player included. This is one that I've done in the last week, especially for here. I couldn't not have one. And Arthur Evans kind of leapt out at me, mainly because he was in the Sportsman's Battalion, which was another unit which served to use the existing groups within society to create the kind of unity that you need for an army unit to function properly. And Arthur Evans was in one of those. I've since learned, though, that from Martin, that he went to that he worked at the school not far from where I live, and indeed drove past to get here. So it's very nice to have those connections. But it's those, as Martin said, with all of these stories, I'm always learning. I have to obviously go away and do research on each of these illustrations. But even when they're done, you find out more information. And I'm sure you've all had it, their names kind of follow you. Wherever you go, you find, oh right, they played there, did they? There's a mention of them there, and you kind of, you get those, the kind of echoes of it stay with you for the rest of your life, presumably. But Arthur Evans, I'm sure, I want to go and see the memorial now. There's a plaque to him at West Buckland, is there?
I think he's added to their war memorial.
At the school. Yeah.
Yeah,
His
so
name's been added,
so I shall have to see if I can go along and have a look. But yes, so Arthur Evans there. And one more final slide. I really want to do something special for here that was beyond just the series. The series themselves are very nice, and I love doing them. But they're quite easy to do. They're a hand-drawn line image that I take into the computer, digitally render. The template is already there for the card, so it's just setting up. This particular one is a watercolour painting, so it's absolutely unique. You can see it over here on the stand, and it's not any player in particular. It is just a representation of Exeter and the sacrifice, and certainly Arthur Evans, and I think Lynch, maybe Bailey, one of them certainly is on Tiepval as well. So there was at least two of them on Tiepval, so I wanted to include the Tiepval monument in the piece as well. That's probably a little bit longer than I was meant to be, but hopefully it's been of interest. Obviously, there's ask me any question at the end of the event, but you can find me on Twitter, Instagram, and if anything you've seen grabs your interest, I've got a print shop and an original shop at the bottom there, and you can find all of the footballers of the Great War series and plenty of other First World War and baseball, if that's your thing, related illustrations on there. Thank you very much.